The end of World War II did not signal an immediate return to normalcy. The cessation of hostilities marked the beginning of an extraordinary transformation, one in which the sprawling infrastructure built to wage war became redundant almost overnight. Command headquarters, the central nervous systems of vast military campaigns, now stood as hollow, monumental relics of a past that had outlived its purpose. These fortresses of command, previously buzzing with strategic meetings and decisions that determined the course of nations, suddenly faced an existential question: what to do with them now that their function had evaporated? At the war's conclusion, there were hundreds of these command centers across Europe, Asia, and the Pacific, spread across a range of buildings from temporary bunkers carved into hillsides to vast, permanent structures designed for sustained operations. The scale of this infrastructure was staggering. In Germany alone, the Third Reich had constructed more than 1,000 underground bunkers, while Britain had established an extensive system of command centers throughout its homeland. In the U.S., the military maintained several hundred key command posts, often equipped with state-of-the-art communication technology. These sites were initially conceived for one singular purpose: to ensure the efficient, coordinated management of war efforts. But with the war over, the need for them had disappeared, leaving only the question of what to do with such monumental, costly structures. The initial decision to repurpose or dispose of wartime command headquarters came swiftly. The pressing concerns were primarily economic. Many of these buildings had been constructed with exorbitant amounts of material and manpower. For instance, Germany's Führerbunker in Berlin, a sprawling complex designed to shield high-ranking Nazis, had cost millions of Reichsmarks to build, and its upkeep during the war had been expensive. The post-war economic situation, especially in Germany, made it impossible to justify the continued maintenance of these colossal structures, particularly when the country was struggling with reconstruction efforts. The Allies, meanwhile, had their own priorities. Demilitarization of the German state was at the forefront of their minds. As a result, many command headquarters were abandoned, left to rot in the wake of a society that was trying to move past the war. The massive bunkers in the Ruhr Valley, once filled with strategic officers and military communication lines, were left to deteriorate. Some were destroyed outright, their concrete walls reduced to rubble by demolitions or repurposed for other uses. The city of Berlin, still divided, saw some of its most important wartime structures razed in the early post-war years. The once pristine war rooms, which had housed high-ranking officers, were abandoned. The expansive underground shelters, originally designed to protect high-level officials from aerial bombardment, were left eerily empty. In contrast, some sites were repurposed for civilian uses. A few of the most centrally located command centers were converted into government buildings, warehouses, or even civilian offices, their military purpose wiped away by the sheer need for space in a war-torn world. For example, the headquarters of the German Army in the city of Würzburg was converted into a civilian administrative building. In the United Kingdom, a number of command posts originally set up for wartime defense were turned into training facilities or converted for regional government use. These repurposing efforts, however, were the exception rather than the rule. The majority of wartime command headquarters found themselves on the receiving end of mass abandonment. While the destruction or conversion of these sites was often driven by logistical and economic pressures, it was also a consequence of political priorities. As the major powers shifted from wartime to peacetime economies, there was little appetite for maintaining the vast military apparatus that had once been so central to global power. The British, for example, while initially keeping some wartime command posts in operation, soon found themselves embroiled in the challenges of managing a post-war economy recovering from the strain of total war. The British government, under intense pressure to curb military spending, began shutting down unnecessary military facilities, and many of the wartime command centers were abandoned or repurposed. This abandonment was particularly pronounced in the former Axis powers. In Germany, for instance, the massive military and administrative apparatus that had once been central to the Nazi regime was swiftly dismantled, with military and government leaders being either imprisoned or tried. The structures they left behind, some of them in excellent condition, were regarded as symbols of a lost and oppressive regime. Their destruction or abandonment symbolized the severing of any link to the past, a necessary part of Germany's denazification process. Meanwhile, in Japan, the situation was complicated by the ongoing American occupation. While many of Japan's wartime command centers had been destroyed during the conflict, some still remained. The Japanese Imperial General Headquarters, the central military command structure during the war, was dissolved in the aftermath of Japan's surrender. The remnants of this organization were systematically erased, both in terms of physical infrastructure and institutional memory. In the years following the war, the Japanese government chose to focus its energies on rebuilding its economy and society, often leaving wartime command posts and related structures neglected. In the United States, the situation was slightly different. With the rise of Cold War tensions and the beginning of the arms race, many American military installations and command centers continued to operate in the early post-war years, albeit under different circumstances. The sheer scale of military infrastructure in the U.S. meant that many of the wartime structures were adapted and maintained for peacetime purposes, such as serving as intelligence hubs, research facilities, or headquarters for military command. Some of the wartime structures were even preserved as historical sites, later becoming museums or monuments to the war effort. However, even in the U.S., as time passed, many of these wartime command centers were either abandoned or demolished, particularly as newer, more advanced facilities took their place. Across Europe, the situation remained fluid. While many of the massive command headquarters built for the war effort were abandoned or repurposed, the ongoing process of rebuilding after the war meant that there was an ongoing demand for resources and infrastructure. This tension between the need for economic recovery and the sheer immensity of wartime structures meant that some command centers simply could not be disposed of quickly enough. In France, for instance, the coastal fortifications that had once supported German military efforts were left standing, remnants of a defeated regime that would slowly decay over the years. While some of these command headquarters were lost to the sands of time, others have survived in some form. The Führerbunker in Berlin, the iconic headquarters of Adolf Hitler during the last years of the war, remains in a state of eerie stillness beneath the city. Though the site is not open to the public, it has become a point of historical interest, a reminder of the war's closing stages. Similarly, some of the bunkers in Norway, originally designed as part of the German occupation's Atlantic Wall, remain intact and are used for historical tours, drawing attention to the scale and effort that went into building these fortresses. The fates of these wartime command centers, whether abandoned, destroyed, repurposed, or preserved, reflect a broader theme of post-war transformation. The sudden obsolescence of so much military infrastructure was a direct result of the end of hostilities, but the process of determining their future was far from straightforward. In the years immediately following the war, the material, political, and economic pressures shaped the fate of these once mighty hubs of military control. While some were rapidly dismantled, others persisted in various forms, silent reminders of a world now gone, still lingering amid the ruins of a lost era. The aftermath of World War II left the world grappling with a new era, one that was defined by an immense shift in priorities. As the last echoes of the war faded, the survival of wartime command headquarters, once the nerve centers of military planning, came into sharper focus. Their fates were largely sealed by the dual pressures of economic recovery and political reshaping. The first years after the war, however, marked a distinct phase in their transformation, which continued into the 1950s and beyond. In the Western world, where military and governmental priorities quickly turned to post-war recovery and Cold War tensions, wartime command centers were frequently abandoned or repurposed. The rapid shift away from large-scale military engagement meant that many of these once bustling facilities stood empty, waiting to be either destroyed or put to other uses. In Britain, for instance, the war had left its mark not just on the landscape but also on the psyche of the public and government officials. While many of the command bunkers were quickly decommissioned, some remained for years. By the late 1940s, however, economic pressures had set in, and even the most strategically located war rooms began to be seen as costly liabilities. A notable example is the War Room beneath Whitehall, the British Cabinet War Rooms, which had housed Winston Churchill and his closest advisors during the height of the conflict. Though it remained operational during the immediate post-war period, the changing political climate meant that it was no longer needed. Instead of being left to fall into disuse, however, the facility was maintained and, in the 1950s, transformed into a tourist site and historical monument. This conversion exemplified the way in which the British were able to balance the historical significance of wartime structures with the practical demands of peacetime. Similarly, in the United States, the immediate post-war years saw the continued use of some wartime command facilities. The U.S. military, for example, had established a number of command posts and operational headquarters to manage the vast scale of its wartime efforts, especially in the Pacific Theater. Once the war ended, these centers were often repurposed for more mundane military functions, such as logistics management or training. This transition was not seamless. The long-term maintenance of these buildings proved expensive, and many of them, particularly those in more remote locations, were abandoned. However, in certain cases, military bases and command centers were transformed into Cold War-era facilities, adapting to new geopolitical realities. One of the more striking examples of the repurposing of command headquarters in the U.S. was the shift to Cold War defense and surveillance. Military command centers, some of which had been used for planning operations in Europe, were converted to monitoring outposts during the early stages of the Cold War. The North American Aerospace Defense Command (NORAD) Center in Colorado, for instance, although built in the 1950s, drew upon lessons learned from World War II command posts. The U.S. military's experience in organizing vast, decentralized military forces during the war shaped its approach to the Cold War, where strategic defense and the rapid mobilization of forces became paramount. In Germany, the situation was more complex. The remnants of Nazi military infrastructure, including many of the key wartime command centers, were symbolic of the nation's dark past. Immediately following the war, these buildings were either demolished or rendered unusable by the Allies, in an effort to sever any connection with the fascist regime that had built them. Berlin, as the heart of Nazi power, saw the destruction of its most iconic military headquarters, including the Führerbunker, which had housed Adolf Hitler during the final days of the war. This bunker, located beneath the Reich Chancellery, was one of the most important symbols of the Nazi regime's totalitarian control. After the war, the structure was eventually sealed and left in disrepair. In the case of the Führerbunker, its location within the heart of Berlin meant that its fate was tied to the city's division during the Cold War. After the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961, the area surrounding the bunker became part of East Berlin, which meant that it was difficult for the West to access. While the Allies had originally planned to preserve certain war-related sites as monuments or museums, the continued occupation of Germany and the division of Berlin made such plans more complicated. The bunker itself was forgotten for decades, buried under rubble, and only rediscovered after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. By that time, the site had been virtually erased from the collective memory. Meanwhile, in the years following World War II, the Western powers turned their attention toward the geopolitical challenges of the Cold War, which necessitated the continued existence of military command centers, albeit for very different purposes. The ability to mobilize forces quickly and the need to coordinate a nuclear deterrence strategy drove the creation of new facilities, often in remote locations far from major urban centers. This development did not occur in a vacuum, however, and many of these new facilities had their origins in the wartime command structures. In Eastern Europe, where the Soviet Union imposed its control over many former Axis territories, the situation was markedly different. In many of these countries, the Soviet Union simply took over the existing infrastructure, including military command posts, which were then integrated into the Soviet military network. The Soviets, intent on projecting power and control, continued to use many of these wartime headquarters throughout the Cold War. In countries like East Germany, Hungary, and Poland, former Nazi command posts became part of the communist war machine, their roles transformed to serve the new geopolitical priorities of the USSR. The large-scale repurposing of these wartime command headquarters also had an unexpected consequence. The secrecy and security that had surrounded these facilities during the war remained in place even as their function shifted. In some cases, the abandonment of these sites left them shrouded in mystery, with little known about their post-war use. In France, the German military command bunkers along the coast, which had once overseen the defense of the Atlantic Wall, were left abandoned after the war. These structures, once at the heart of Nazi occupation, were simply forgotten. Yet, as the Cold War grew more tense, these same bunkers became the focus of rumors, their connection to the broader network of military infrastructure still present, though largely unknown to the public. Across the Pacific, the situation was similarly complicated. In Japan, many of the command headquarters were left in ruins, particularly those in the Pacific Islands where the final battles of the war had taken place. The Japanese Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, for example, was systematically dismantled by the Allied occupation forces as part of the denazification process. However, the remnants of the military infrastructure remained hidden, buried beneath the rebuilt city. In many cases, wartime command centers in Japan were abandoned to make way for civilian reconstruction. This process continued throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, as Japan's new government sought to sever its connections with its wartime past and move towards recovery. In the years following the war, many of the former command centers, bunkers, and military installations around the world simply faded into obscurity. Some were lost to history, overgrown by nature, or demolished to make room for new developments. Others, however, became significant landmarks of the past, preserved as museums or memorials to the war effort. The remnants of these sites, often decaying and forgotten, now serve as somber reminders of a world that once relied on them for survival.